today off with news the parts for ULA's new Vulcan rocket have shipped. Now, if you don't know what Vulcan is set to be the replacement for the Atlas V and the Delta IV, ULA's current two heavy lift vehicles, and Vulcan's going to replace them. Now, Atlas is currently on its way out. I believe it has roughly 40 launches left in it. Delta has 2. Sucks. I love Delta, my favorite rocket of all time. But it was fairly cost prohibitive. Delta 4 was made for a market that was going to come theoretically in the 90s. About 98, that's when Delta 2 or Delta 5, Delta 4 and Atlas 5 were both meant to kind of capitalize in that market. One thing led to another, the dot-com bubble came. Now, the problem that came with the dot-com bubble is basically they were predicting hundreds of launches every few years. They got nothing. There were actually a couple of years where the pads for Delta and Atlas were just vacant. And the US government basically said, we want to keep you alive because we kind of need you in case we need to launch stuff. But these companies didn't want to have to pay to keep the pads open. They were just going to cancel rockets. So the US government said to, at the time, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, we're going to form you together. We're going to force you to merge and create a conglomerate called the United Launch Alliance, and we're going to pay you $600 million a year to keep your pads warm. And that's what they did. Now, eventually the launch market did heat up, and we got a lot of launches out of Atlas V and a couple launches out of Delta, but nothing compared to what Vulcan is planned to do. Now, Vulcan already has a ton of contracts near the mid-80s, and we know the biggest one they have is Amazon's Project Kuiper. Now, I don't have a thing set up to show it off here, but Project Kuiper is basically going to be Amazon's way to compete with Starlink, and they bought 40 ULA Atlas V, or they bought 4 Atlas V launches, and they bought 40 Vulcan launches. So this rocket is planned to fly a lot. It does also have plans to reuse those engines. There's a photo of these engines somewhere. I guess not here, though. Those BE4 engines, you can kind of see them right there with the tarp over them. Those engines are going to be reused via what they're calling smart reuse. So basically, this is your booster. You got your engines here. These engines are going to separate. They're going to move off after this first stage has done its job. This is going to come in, re-enter, burn up. These are going to turn themselves around, right? They're actually going to maintain the current heading, but they're going to deploy an inflatable parachute or an inflatable heat shield. And they're going to come in through the Earth's atmosphere using that inflatable heat shield. Now, this was tested with the NASA Lofted mission, which they tested inflatable heat shields. And then they will deploy a parachute, and then ULA will be able to catch these engines out of the water and use them again. This is called smart reuse. Now, the economics, I know a lot of people debate over. Smart reuse makes a lot of sense for how often ULA will be launching. Boats and barges are very expensive. SpaceX pays a lot of money to keep their spots in Port Canaveral. With what ULA plans on doing, they only need a helicopter, which is a lot cheaper. Plus, they plan on launching at most 2 times a month, which really the cadence doesn't work out for. SpaceX needs to launch, I believe, 40 times a year for the cadence to work out for having a drone ship. ULA probably will never get to that point with Vulcan. So it would make sense to do a different type of reuse because the engines, in this case the BE4s, are roughly 70% of the cost of the first stage. Now, okay, here's actually a few of the engines. This is another view of Vulcan. You can see it's been verticated here, brought from horizontal to vertical, where it's now being mounted to the mobile launcher. In a couple days, the mobile launcher will move out to the pad with the Centaur 5 on top of it, and it will perform a static fire and a wet dress rehearsal. Basically, they're going to fill it with its fuels, liquid oxygen and liquid methane. They're going to fire the engines for an undetermined amount of time, probably 3 to 10 seconds, I would guess. And they're going to bring back to the pad, mount the payload on top of it, mount whatever side boosters are needed for this mission. I believe it's 2 side boosters for the first one. Bring it back out to the pad, and launch the damn thing. If I had to guess, this is a purely an educated guess based on what I've seen, how quick they're moving, where all the parts are. I'm going to guess they're about 2 months away from launching at this point. I'm going to guess mid-March would be my guess for Vulcan, which is crazy. Because if you would have told me 3 years ago that Vulcan was going to be the first methane-powered rocket, that I would think Vulcan's going to be the first methane-powered rocket to reach orbit, I would have thought you were insane. A lot of rockets do not reach orbit on their first try. ULA has never had a launch failure ever. Now, there's always time for that to change. That being said, I do not think Vulcan is going to change that. ULA takes a very steady approach, similar to how NASA does it, and I do not think we will see a failure of Vulcan's first flight. The only rocket right now, in my knowledge, that could beat it methane to orbit that I think would even have a chance would be Terran 1. But Terran 1 has a lot of new technology that I think it's probably going to have a failure on its first flight. Starship, I can almost guarantee a failure on its first flight. As amazing as it is, and we'll get to some stuff about Starship later, something that insane, you are probably going to fail. If I had to guess, you're going to have a failure about a minute into flight. Something weird is going to happen. And even then, we'll talk more about that later. It is an insane rocket, and it's probably going to take them a couple tries to get used to how to fly it. Speaking of flying, Blue Origin, they had a failure of their New Shepard rocket. I want to see if I can pull up a video here. Let me go over to YouTube on this monitor and bring it up over. Blue Origin failure. Now, this wasn't a huge deal. Okay. If there were people on board, which there were not in this case, this would not have been the worst possible scenario, as they did prove that the abort system works, which they'd already proven in a test, but they proved yet again the abort system works. Now, we still don't know what happened here. Blue has not said anything. I remember distinctly watching this, and then being like, oh, what's the engine doing? And then being like, oh shit, because rockets aren't supposed to do that, and Blue has had a perfect safety record up until this point, including a mission where they were meant to test this, in which case they thought the booster was going to be burnt to a crisp and non-landable, and when they first tested this, they were actually able to land the booster. In this case, obviously, they couldn't. Last thing we saw of the booster, it was in there, and the engine exploded, so not great. But they did file for an FCC license to launch. This is for the antennas or communication downlink and uplink between the vehicle and their ground station in Van Horn in Blue Ranch, Texas. So the thing says this is for applications is for suborbital flights of the launch system, which include the booster and the capsule. These are antennas both on the booster and the capsule that need to talk. And this is for telemetry downlinks for New Shepard, the reusable space launch vehicle. So hopefully this means we're going to start seeing them soon. Now, it does say this goes into effect on April 1st of this year and ends on June 1st of this year. You do have to constantly be refiling these things, but the fact that they filed one for April 1st is a good deal because they did let their previous one run out without having to file a new thing as they were continuing their investigation. But looks like hopefully we might be reaching a conclusion to that investigation relatively shortly. As for more Blue Origin news, some New Glenn parts were spotted. Now, if you don't know what New Glenn is Blue Origin's first orbital vehicle and a absolutely huge vehicle. This thing is similar size to Starship. This thing is a similar size to Starship, actually. You can see there's New Glenn. There was Starship a couple iterations ago. You can see this thing is as tall as China's theoretical Long March 9, almost as tall as the Saturn V, and almost as tall as Starship. This thing is huge. Most people will do what SpaceX did and go for a Falcon 1 for the first orbital rocket. Blue Origin said, screw that, we're going as big as we can. Now these are for test demonstration purposes only right now. However, it means we're getting closer. This you can see a tank. This is GS1 tank that inside their tank cleaning facility at their base in Mare Island. This appears to be an interstage. You can see these 4 pipes here. Most likely those will connect to the canards, which they will use to kind of glide it in. As you can see here, get a better picture here. As you can see, they do have canards on them. There are 4 where the grid fence would be on a Falcon 9, and they use those to kind of glide themselves in, because you're not going to want to come straight in like this. You're going to want to come in straight and then do a turn over to the landing site. That's what those do. And these 2 fins in radial symmetry, that on the vehicle, also extend what's known as its cross-range distance. Again, that's all for landing. So we see that there, the interstage. This is stage 2, I believe. This will be for... I think these are both tanks for stage 2, or this is the methane tank, or this is the oxygen tank, actually, for stage 1. And this is its landing leg system. The legs will kind of deploy out like this, from what we understand. They'll kind of deploy outward and then slide, which is a pretty cool landing system. I'm really excited to see how New Glenn finally flies, and I'm excited to keep seeing more of this stuff. You can see here that they call this the ground service 1, I guess. That would be what GS1 is, or... I don't know what GS1 is, actually, now that I think about it, but this is the aft vertical build. I don't think these are flight hardware. If I had to guess, these are testing hardware. That being said, we have seen testing hardware before, so this might actually be flight hardware. Let's see. Hardware we've seen being processed. The tanks have been wearing sneakers to avoid being... Yeah, I don't know. These could be flight hardware. Blue is very secretive, so they're not going to tell us. But either way, it's always awesome to see progress being taken with Blue Origin. As secretive as they are, progress is great to see. Now, let's go to SpaceX updates. We're going to quickly kind of go through these, because there are people that cover this way better than I can, and already cover a lot of this. Starship had a wet dress rehearsal. They filled Starship and Super Heavy with full of liquid methane and liquid oxygen. This is some beautiful drone shots from SpaceX here that you can see. Absolutely incredible. Look at that. Look at that. I think... Now, there was a symposium, AIAA Science Tech. I don't know what the name of the symposium was, but we did get SpaceX Vice President of Build and Flight Reliability said on January 27th, that was... How many days ago was that? That was on Friday. Saying that if all things goes well, we'll see a 33-engine static fire next week. Oh boy. Now, I and a lot of others have been critical of SpaceX, saying that there's a problem that they are ignoring that could cause them great strife. That's a water deluge system. But we're starting to see signs. Now, CSI Starbase, if you don't know who he is, I would argue, the greatest person when it comes to finding stuff at SpaceX and Starbase. He does an incredible job. So he's noticed here these cavities being emptied. There's also currently a bunch of tanks being head over from a barge that are meant to arrive on February 2nd. Those are for the water deluge system. Now, what's interesting is it seems like they're getting all the stuff for water deluge system to build it after the first flight, which is interesting, because oftentimes you'd think you'd want a water deluge system for your first flight. Apparently, SpaceX disagrees. Now, they know more than me. Obviously, I'm sure they have information I don't. I don't know why you wouldn't just wait a month to install your water deluge system, but we'll see how it works out. Either way, that 33-engine static fire is going to be absolutely insane. I am so excited to see it, and we'll hopefully, cross our fingers, get to talk about this next week. Now let's cover some aviation news. We got some sad news first. The last 747 coming off the line, the queen of the sky. It's sad. I love the 747. It's going to Atlas Air, and on the 31st, on Tuesday, they'll be doing a live presentation over on this link on Vimeo about the final delivery of the 747. This thing has served well over 50 years as the queen of the sky. She is huge, she is powerful, she is reliable, one of the greatest planes ever built. I don't think anyone would ever argue that. And it's going to be sad to see the final one roll off the line. Now, what's interesting is it's technically not the final one that they're going to be working on in the official Boeing factory, as there is 2 planes that are currently 747-800 is currently being modified to become the new Air Force Ones. Or maybe, I guess the president's planes, is Air Force One is actually fun fact, Air Force One is just the call sign of any plane the president is on. It could be a Cessna, and technically that is Air Force One. But some sad aviation news there. And it's also sad when there are air accidents. It's also sad when they're not reported on well. So, let's go over the actual incident that happened. On the 18th of January 2023, a Qantas Boeing 737-800 WL, don't know what the WL stands for, was traveling from Auckland International to Sydney Kingsford Smith International Airport. Now, we don't have much information, but we know at a point in the flight, the plane suffered an engine failure en route, and the airline stated that one engine was shut down by the flight crew about an hour from Sydney, and the aircraft then continued on to Sydney to land because they were so close, and it was actually the closest airport because they're just over the water. And they had planes can safely fly in one engine. Now, some genius reporters got out there, and we're hoping, what if you can get a picture of this damaged engine? Now, oftentimes engine damage is internal, doesn't mean you can't necessarily see stuff on the outside. And they saw it, and they were like, I got it. I see what the failure of the engine is. There is a giant hole in the plane's engine. Now, anyone who knows about aviation may have heard of a thing called reverse I can't spell REVIRC. Sure. Reverse thrust. Now, reverse thrust is in which a plane uses some type of a thing called a bucket. Now, this is the old school way of doing it, where the engine, right, as exhaust coming out through here, these 2 buckets are normally like this, come out like this, which causes the exhaust when it hits it to hit it and then redirect itself out this way, going forward, slowing the plane down. Every jumbo jet has this. You can see here some different methods. Now, this is what most of them look like nowadays. So basically, as this bucket comes out, if this image wants to load, okay, here. As this bucket comes out, little fins are dropped, stopping this backflow of air. As you can see right here, you can see the red is normally up. Once this bucket slides out, those red fins are dropped out, which forces what's known as the bypass air. This air that goes through this bypass right here, and that doesn't actually go through the main machinery of the engine to hit it and go around like that. Every plane has this. This is what the version on the Airbus looks like. This is what most planes, or this is what most Airbus planes have. This is what most engines have, that type. So it's funny that an aviation reporter wouldn't notice that. What baffles me is that not a single reporter at the Daily Telegraph cross-checked their research. Not a single one decided to cross-check. That is insane, and I don't even know what the response to that by the Daily Telegraph should be. The editors in charge of the paper should surely go and actually check stuff out, make sure that they're not spreading false information. I mean, here's a photo that someone posted of an A380 doing that. Fun fact, the wingspan on A380 is so big that these two side engines can't deploy reverse thrust because on a lot of runways they'd be eating up the grass, and they don't want to do that. But they didn't look up any plane, ever. Okay, well, that's not it. But they didn't look up any plane to see if that's... It's pathetic. What's not pathetic, though, is new technology. NASA has picked Boeing to develop a transonic truss-based wing for sustainable X-planes. What the hell does that mean? I think a lot of people... Oh, my audio just got really weird there for a second. I think a lot of people will look at this and be like, what the hell does that mean? Talk to me in English. And it might be kind of hard to do that, but NASA has awarded $4.7 million in funding through milestone payments. Okay. NASA signed a funded Space Act agreement with Boeing under which it to provide $425 million in funding through milestone payments, while Boeing and its industry partners contribute $725 million. A year-long test flight campaign is planned to begin at NASA Armstrong Flight Research Center in California in 2028 to develop this thing. Now, why would we want this thing? Most of you might be thinking, well, it doesn't even look like a damn plane. At least what we think of as a plane. And it's not a conventional plane. This is what's known as a trussed X-wing design. And what's nice about them is basically they fix a lot of the problems that current planes have. With the long, slender wing structure braced by a truss that also generates lift, increases the span and reduces the lift-to-drag ratio. The TTBW's wingspan is about 50% longer than cantilevered wings on an equivalent conventional single-aisle aircraft. So what they're saying is basically this thing is a 50% bigger wingspan than a 7.3 without having an actual bigger wingspan. It's able to achieve that via having those extra little trusses there. Those add to its overall wingspan when it comes to terms of lift. The wing design alone is expected to reduce fuel burn by up to 10% over conventional cantilevered wings on today's most efficient single-aisle aircraft. Combined with advanced propulsion and composite structures and other technologies, they expect this to reduce emissions by at least 30%. Now that is big. As we continue to aim for carbon neutrality in the United States, stuff like this is very big and very exciting. I do hope Boeing actually follows through with this. Boeing has been known to take contracts in the past for big stuff and then never actually do anything. I don't have an example off the top of my head that I can think of, but they have been known to take grants, basically start building and say, hey, in the wind tunnel, this doesn't blah, 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 we're not going to finish this. And then NASA basically has to accept whatever they say and be like, okay, well, we'll fine then. Don't build it. Luckily, smaller companies don't have to deal with that, and we get stuff like this. A hydrogen-powered fuel cell power for a Dash 8 engine. You can see here. Look at that. So this engine is not being run by any fuel. This engine is being run by what's known as a hydrogen power plant, or basically a fuel cell, which gets its power through turning hydrogen gas or hydrogen into water. It gets its power through that process, then can be used to drive an electric motor, which drives a propeller. That's a really awesome, sustainable way to drive aircraft. Now, sadly, propeller aircraft are kind of on their way out, but I think with this technology, we can see a big boom. Here's another example from just this week as well. Zero Ava flies a prototype of hydrogen electric regional power plant. This is an 18-seat Donner 228. They made a 10-minute flight with a fully hydrogen electric power head. They ran roughly, I believe, they ran 50% on the hydrogen power, 50% on batteries. Where's that number? No, it's here somewhere. Well, okay. Either way, the takeoff weight 5,650 kilograms. The modified 228 is the largest and heaviest aircraft to fly with a hydrogen electric propulsion. Zero Ava flew a 200 kilowatt demonstrator system in a converted 6-seat Piper Malibu. That was a while ago. On this first flight, the Donner 228 reached 2,000 feet and 120 knots, receiving 50% power from the left side electric motor from the fuel cell system and 50% from the batteries. Gaseous hydrogen takes up tanks at 350 bar and 2 multi-cell stacks inside the fuselage. So it's going to take a lot to store hydrogen like this. This is a very interesting challenge that's being presented. Hydrogen is a bitch. Ask anyone that has to work with it. It wants to go anywhere and everywhere it can. Since it's the smallest chemical, it can basically get through anything. So if you want to actually keep it inside, you need to store it at very, very, very high pressures, which they're doing in these demonstrators by having the tanks at 350 bar. Now, is that sustainable? I don't know. I don't know. 350 bar is very, very, very high pressure. That would make me, as someone who's done engineering, worry a little bit. But, I'm sure they know what they're doing. They don't go into too much detail about the actual tank technology. I'm sure they know what they're doing. I mean, to put that in perspective, 350 bar is actually the same chamber pressure as the combustion chamber in the Raptor engine. So it's very high pressure, equivalent to that of one of the most powerful rocket engines ever fired. Now, saving the best news for last. Nerva is back. Nuclear power is the way of the future in space, and I am all here for it. This is a picture of a demonstration that NASA will be performing, an Arctic concept at least, of what this could look like by the year 2027. NASA has partnered with DARPA and the Space Force to test nuclear thermoelectric propulsion by the year 2027. Now, they don't give much details, probably because they don't know much. If I had to guess, NASA is going to give what's known as a RFPI, or a request for information, where basically they're going to say, hey, you, Boeing, you want to give us an idea? You want to give us concept Lockheed, UN, Raytheon, UN? They're basically going to go to all these companies and say, hey, give us a proposal for what you think this should look like. Whatever one is the most realistic, the cheapest, combination of different factors, NASA will most likely choose to be the one to do the demonstration. As for what this is going to launch on, and all that, not figured out yet. Now, they also say some really cool stuff in here, if I can find it, about using it as a on-orbit, NASA has a long history of collaborating with DARPA, such as on projects. Has a long history of collaborating with DARPA on projects that enable respective missions, such as in-space servicing, which is a really interesting concept where we can basically use this thing, because of how long this engine can fire, how efficient it is, to go to different satellites that are now defunct, pick them up, take them down, deorbit them, deploy them, go back into an orbit, and then continue on. This thing can do that for a while, most likely, based on how efficient nuclear propulsion is. That was from NASA Director Pam Melroy. Expanding our partnership to nuclear propulsion will help drive forward NASA's goals of sending humans to Mars. Also said by NASA Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy. That's really interesting. I think a lot of people think that SpaceX is going to be the ones to get us to Mars. And I do think Starship will be involved in some way. However, I do not think NASA will let SpaceX land on Mars without having any NASA involvement. If I had to put money down, on how we are going to get to Mars, it is going to be through some joint involvement between NASA and SpaceX. NASA building some sort of on-orbit space station in which will feature nuclear propulsion is kind of what they're saying here. That will do the main stuff, burns to and from Mars. Starship will serve as the lander, similar-ish to what we're doing at the moon with Lunar Gateway. Just instead of, Gateway just sitting in orbit, Gateway is going to be traveling with us, if that makes sense. And that will all probably be staged at Lunar Gateway, because that is the plans for Gateway, is for that to be staging ground for future missions to Mars. DARPA and NASA have a long history of fruitful collaborations and advancing technology for our respective goals. From the Saturn V rocket that took humans to the moon for the first time to robotic servicing and refueling of satellites. Why would DARPA want this? That's kind of my question. DARPA is, what's the exact? Yeah, demonstrate. Oh, that's not Defense Advancement Research Projects Agency. Defense. Why would the Department of Defense want this? That's kind of my question. Well, what does the Department of Defense serve to gain from nuclear thermal propulsion? I don't think they want us to know. I can tell you that much. We know that the DoD has very big interest in Starship, and using Starship as a very quick to launch, and quick to land, basically anywhere with a bunch of troops. I would not be surprised if the DoD basically builds their own Starship pad and pays to have a couple Starships ready. With the way they've been talking about it, they're investing a lot into Starship for that. So I wonder then. To me, it seems like the future of rockets with the DoD was that. Then what do they get from having nuclear thermal propulsion, unless they need something that's really efficient? They want to be able to keep up there for decades on end, which is possible. Recent aerospace materials and engineering advancements enable a new era of space nuclear technology, and this flight demonstration will be a major achievement towards establishing a space transportation capability for the Earth to Moon economy. It's exciting. This is going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. We know under Bridenstine in, I think, 2022. God, no, I think it was like 2020 actually. I feel so old. Everything. They restarted the NERVA program. NERVA was created a while ago, and it was a goal for building nuclear thermal rocket engines. You can see it here. This ended up getting canceled because basically NASA couldn't find a reason to justify NERVA at the time. And Bridenstine reached a deal with the Department of Energy to create, basically to bring NERVA back. Now you can see this doesn't look exactly like what we see this engine in this picture looking as. Most likely, our understanding of rocket engines has changed a bit since the mid-70s. Nevertheless, the dream of nuclear propulsion lives on. I really do hope we see this. Nuclear propulsion, if you've ever played Kerbal Space Program, is truly a godsend when it comes to faraway missions. And being able to have something like a continuous 1G propulsion, or continuous 0.9G propulsion for the entirety of a flight to Mars, basically you wouldn't need to accommodate yourself to different gravity. That's a really interesting possibility that's now being opened up with projects like this. I still think that technology is a long time away. I'd be surprised if we actually saw this thing launch in 2027 and not get pushed to 2030. But nevertheless, it is a really interesting concept, and I'm really excited to see how this plays out, what it gets used for. In general, having electric nuclear powered rocket engines again. Again, we built this thing so long ago. We built test beds for it and just never did anything with this. This is what I was saying earlier about the everything we're getting to Mars. This was the plan for the Constellation program. And I can do a whole video on the Constellation program and why it was stupid that it was canceled. But basically, if I had to guess, this is how we'd be getting to Mars. But instead of here being an Orion, this is a giant Starship. This is an Orion. Crew tunnel, and then you're gonna have your nuclear fuel tank, and then some nuclear engines buckled to it, along with this kind of pressurized cargo vessel here, inflatable. What's interesting is we basically have all the parts of the of the Constellation program now outside of Ares 1. Basically, NASA canceled something for to save $30 billion. We're now like $38 billion in the SLS program, and have gotten everything that we would have gotten out of Constellation outside of Ares 1. Very, very stupid, but again, we can talk about that later. It's very exciting to see this. Again, if you do continuous propulsion, you're not going to need something like solar panels because these typically have alternators on them. A lot of rocket engines actually have alternators. This was a concept of using a nuclear rocket engine on the Saturn V's upper stage. But in fact, Nerva actually has the same TWR as the RL-10 engine, which is what flies on SLS, Delta 2, or Delta 4, Atlas 5, Vulcan. The RL-10 rocket engine produces, forget how many tons of thrust, but this does have the same propulsion, roughly same TWR as Nerva. And the Nerva has much higher efficiency, and RL-10 is already the most efficient rocket engine, conventional rocket engine. So it's exciting to see what something like Nerva would be capable of doing. We got a lot of really interesting stuff to look forward to. We have a lot of cool stuff this week. Vulcan parts shipping, new Glenn parts spotted, SpaceX wet dress rehearsal, the last 747, electric planes, more efficient planes, electric planes, and nuclear rocket engines. A lot of really awesome stuff this week. If I had to pick a favorite thing, it probably has to be this. I'm sorry. I know I said I wasn't going to talk too much about Starship, but like, come on. This thing is going to be so amazing when it finally fires its 33 rocket engines. I might do like a reaction live stream to that. That will be really cool. Until then, though, I bid you adieu. Goodbye.